آخر جلسة لليوم حول استخدام العنف الجنسي كسلاح حرب using sexual violence as a weapon of war. بندعي للمنصة سيلفيا أكان, survivor and activist, co-founder of Global Women Vision Uganda. Rachel Dorweeks, UN Women's Regional Advisor for the Arab States on Peace and Security, USA. Malini Laxminarayan, Program Manager at the Mukwege Foundation and Speaker, Netherlands. Attorney Antonia Mulvey, Founder and Executive Director of Legal Action Worldwide, LAW, a lawyer with over 20 years of experience. She founded the first Women Lawyers Association in Somalia, established the first law faculty in Puntland, Somalia, and the first paralegal programs in Darfur, Sudan, United Kingdom. بحاورون الكاتب والصحافي شاكر خزعل. تفضلوا لو سمحتوا. شاكر. بليز الأسامي لو سمحتوا. خليني أذكر بتويتر أكثر شخص اليوم أكتف على تويتر مع هاشتاج ووفل 2019 رح بيربح جايزة نسحبها بالقرعة من مجوهرات كلاس. فيكم تبلشوا شاكر.
مايك. يا.
Jan Sylvia.
Last session, so thank you for being here today. Very important topic we're going to be discussing. For as long as we can remember, there has been war and conflict in our world. And with war and conflict, there are so many issues that are raised with it. One of the crimes that happen with war and conflict, whether that is World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Syrian War, any war that happens has things that happen, crimes that happen, one of which is sexual violence. While meeting the panelists just before the session, I tried to actually say a statement that we couldn't come into an agreement with. The statement was, is sexual violence on rise or not? And we couldn't come up with a conclusion for that because how much can we actually depend on the statistics? How many of these crimes are reported? I'm going to start the panel with Sylvia. Sylvia.
Yes.
Sylvia's going... It's not... Okay. Everything well with... So, Sylvia is a survivor of this crime who's going to reflect with us a little bit on her experience with sexual violence. I give the role for Sylvia now.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's my first time to be here in Lebanon. I'm Achan Sylvia. I'm not the co-founder, I'm the founder of Golden Women Vision in Uganda, a war survivor. supporting the war survivor. According to what he said, I have to tell you my experience as a war survivor. It wasn't easy from my side to be like this at this moment. It was during the rebel attack by the Lord's Resistance Army, where I was abducted by the rebels and taken to the bush. During that time, my sister held me and we were running into the hide. Unfortunately, during that time, she was shot. She was 2 months pregnant. She was shot at that spot as holding my hand. She fell down. Again, the rebels had to come and begin slaughtering her again like an animal. I was 13 years old, and I had to lie in a pool of blood. The rebels didn't leave me. I moved with them. They said they're not leaving me. I moved with them, and the rebels did not have the vehicle. We were footing, heading to southern Sudan by foot from Uganda. So when we arrived in one of the bush, my legs were swollen that I couldn't move anymore. Then I asked one of the rebel commander who was holding AK-47, having a rank. So it wasn't easy for me. I told them I was tired and my legs were swollen. Then the rebel commander told me, if you are tired and you want to rest, we shall make you rest for good. I realized they might kill me. I begged again that, please, I can still walk with you. Then we walked about good meters, about 36 kilometers by foot. When we reached a destination, I was praying that maybe if the government Ugandan soldiers come in, I will maybe have to escape from there. Reaching about that kilometers, I started hearing the gunshot. The Mambas were now entering into crossfire. So what I did, I had just to lie down straight to escape too many bullets that I was seeing ahead of me. When the gun was silent, after 35 minutes there, I rose up. All the rebels had escaped. We had many abductees who were really having wounds, and I just stood up. I stood up, and again they tied me in 3 pieces. One of the rebels was around there, tied me into 3 pieces. As their luggage that I was carrying was still on me, I told them, please, there's nothing I can do. You can do what you want. And I told the government soldier they had to rescue me. After rescuing me, they took me to the rehabilitation center. At that center, you are supposed to stay for 6 months, but I kindly requested the center. It was called Gusco. I stayed for almost only 3 months. From there, I requested them that I have to go back to my village. I went back to my village. I found my mother was kidnapped. She was not there. I asked for my father where he was. They told me that very day you were abducted, your father was killed. Then I had nowhere to stay. I didn't give up, but I thought now I had also not reason to stay, but I had to move to the IDP camps and stay at the people's homes, begging for food for me to survive, with the aim of begging people so that I could study and acquire my paper and support my community members and the war survivors. I got a bachelor degree in social work and social administration, again went ahead and got a degree in development studies with the aim of supporting the war survivors and the community at large. I joined the Norwegian Refugee Council and worked for 9 years. I stopped the work in 2009. I was working with the IDP camps, with the World Food Program as well. They were supporting the Norwegian Refugee Council. In that ID camp, we were giving the non-food items and the food items. I saw my people were not really getting enough psychosocial support. Indeed, the women were committing suicide. We had a lot of suicidal cases. Then I said, no, I need to resign from this job. I resigned in 2009. Then I stayed home. In 2011, I founded the organization called Golden Women Vision in Uganda.
Sylvia, for your organization, how does it work that you are a survivor yourself and then you're dealing with other survivors? How do women relate to you, and how do you relate to other women in the scope of your work?
You know, with that, as they said, experience is the best teacher. What I underwent really touched the life of my people. That made even the king of my clan, of the Acholi region in northern Uganda, had to look for me because I was testifying and getting open to support my fellow war survivors.
I know it's not as planned in the order we had agreed on, but I'm gonna move to you, Rachel, with the United Nations for Women. When I hear cases like Sylvia's, I, as someone listening to the story, it angers me. How does the UN look at this crime, at these crimes happening in conflict that we, as the world, we're witnesses of it? What's your outlook to it as the United Nations for Women?
I mean, I think our outlook is similar to all of yours, which is with horror, trying to watch indescribable pain and violence, and feeling helpless to stop it, and feeling like we're never able to provide the full remit of services, as you mentioned, in terms of both health and psychosocial support and legal justice-related services that we need to provide. There's a number of tools that the UN can bring to bear on this. A lot of these have been set out in various Security Council resolutions. We've had 4 Security Council resolutions specifically on sexual violence, which does demonstrate to some degree the international interest and commitment within the UN and member states to trying to address sexual violence. Now we have peacekeeping operations. Almost all of the major peacekeeping operations have mandates on protecting, preventing, and addressing sexual violence. Many of the peacekeeping missions also have protection of civilian mandates, and all of that, including our humanitarian services, are trying to come together to bring to bear to be an effective response to crimes of sexual violence. I mean, I think one of the key comments that I was going to make on this, which was made by Celine, who did a fantastic presentation before me, was not only is sexual violence it's not only about the impact of the individual, and that impact is horrific, as we've heard, but also the impact on communities and societies. It's a huge driver of displacement. It undermines, of course, the rule of law and any kind of faith in justice institutions. And it also breaks apart communities. So when we're talking about peace and justice and stability, sexual violence, which is often seen as a personal crime, something that families have to reconcile, that individuals have to reconcile, it's not seen as a tactic of war, there's increasing recognition, but too often it's not seen as a tactic of war and something that we have to address collectively. And so while we see various piecemeal efforts to address it, we don't see the writ large collective work that we need to address impunity around sexual violence, to prevent it, both to ensure justice for its survivors and justice for its perpetrators, but also as a preventive tool to ensure that those who are looking to perpetrate sexual violence as a tactic of war understand the consequences of doing so.
I have to ask you this question because we live in 2019. The information, the transmission of information is way faster today than ever before. It has been documented, it has been mentioned, and a lot of people raise the concern that some, very few perhaps, of UN members have been condemned, engaged, or even accused of participating in sexual violence acts while they're serving on missions. How does the UN respond to that? UN for Women respond to that? And what's the position of UN for Women when it comes to actually, and we need to ask this question because even yesterday, today we live in the times of Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, this is a question often raised. Well, the UN does it too.
It's true. I mean, I think the UN is moving mountains to deliver incredible amounts of humanitarian aid and trying to prevent conflict and to maintain the peace, but at the same time there are a certain number of individuals who are sullying that, so to speak, who are perpetrating these horrendous crimes. And I think the UN is clear that we have a zero tolerance policy on that, and that it happens, and that there are a lot of people working to address that. But certainly that work is never enough. From a peacekeeping standpoint, it's not only about the UN, but it's also about multiple actors. Ultimately, the jurisdiction to prosecute these crimes is with member states. So member states have to be willing to take people back home and then prosecute them in their own courts, which is often a very difficult subject to have within the UN. And for humanitarian workers or staff, the UN needs to be willing to waive immunities and allow it to be referred to national courts, which does happen, but certainly needs to happen more often.
And just to conclude with you on a question, honestly, and just from someone who's angered by this matter, very angered by the matter of sexual violence, do you think the UN has been efficient in doing that? I mean, we talked about the Vietnam War. I mentioned earlier in my introduction, World War I, World War II. We look today at the war in Syria and so on, and we're seeing this matter on repeat. And as people today, we have access to information more than before. Do you think on an individual and on a UN level, has the UN been efficient in addressing the crimes of sexual violence during wars?
We had not prepared this question ahead of time, let me say, so thank you for putting me on the spot.
No
I'm
problem.
Sure there's others in this room who might be better placed to provide the response. I mean, listen, the UN can be criticized for many things, and we are a lightning bolt for...
Sorry, I'm not criticizing the UN.
Sure.
I'm just raising up a straight-on question. Has the UN been efficient? I talked about World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. So, in your opinion, and as the UN, I'm definitely not criticizing or condemning the UN. I'm just asking a question that could be raised from the audience or could be raised from anyone. Has the UN been efficient in addressing this crime?
Okay.
In policies and how it affects also state members who are there?
I'll do my best to answer it. First, I cannot speak on behalf of the UN. I can speak on behalf of UN Women. It depends what our measure of efficiency is, whether we're measuring it for a value for money or whatever it may be. I think the UN has put all of the resources that we can behind it. We've seen that through the Security Council, we've seen that through, so if we're looking at the legislative frameworks, those are in place. We also have commissions of inquiry, fact-finding missions. We have the ICC, International Criminal Court, which the UN is partnering with closely in terms of work around implementing the Rome Statute. At the service level, we have huge humanitarian aid delivery that is trying to address the survivors of victims. It is not enough. So, for example, in Yemen, the protection sector, when we look at the appeals, GBV is under-resourced. Currently, for the appeal for 2018, only 36% of the protection appeal was funded. There is a need for more resources. The UN certainly needs to do more. We need to be doing more collectively with our member states. Are we efficient at it? There is room for improvement, but I think if we're looking at a holistic response, trying to address it from a policy perspective, from a legal perspective, documentation, and the needs of survivors, I think it is a multifaceted and a holistic response.
Thank you. I move to Antonia. I'm going to ask you sort of a similar question, but more from a legal point of view. If we look at the history of how the world deals with this kind of crimes, how has it sort of, if you can give us, has there been an improvement, would you say, from 50 years ago of how countries, governments, legal systems are put in place to address, and by address, I don't mean talk about it. By address, I mean put policies in place to protect and to condemn and to apply justice to the victims in this case. Can you give us, like, how has the world evolved in the last 50, 60 years, or 70 years, if we want to talk about that?
That's a very small question. I will try my best to answer it. It's a really interesting question because here we're looking at data and statistics and what do we know about the level and the scale and the nature of sexual violence. And I think this goes to one of the real difficulties that we have in reporting, investigating and prosecuting sexual violence, crimes and conflict, which is the issue of reporting. That where do you report? There's a great deal of stigma, cultural difficulties in reporting these crimes. So it's been very difficult to understand the nature and scale and how it's changed over the last 50 to 70 years. I would like to make a comment, though, on the legal framework. If we look at the last 20 years, the International Criminal Court was established in 2002. We've had the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia and Rwanda. We heard this morning of the Security Council Resolution 1325 and the numerous Security Council resolutions that have followed that, all addressing sexual violence. So if we look at the legal framework, I would ask you, why have we not been better at addressing this very serious crime? Because the framework is there. I would tell you that the political will is not there to address this crime. We have never seen so few referrals to the International Criminal Court. Member states are calling for accountability for this crime, but those same member states are restricting their legislation to have these crimes investigated and prosecuted in their own countries, such as the UK. And if we look at national justice systems where the violation may have taken place, in conflict contexts, they're often unable or unwilling to investigate and prosecute these crimes because often state security forces are involved in these crimes. I can talk to you about a positive initiative by the UN as being a recent UN investigator, but let me know if I should talk about that, because I think it is quite a positive experience of the action that the UN has taken in Myanmar.
Like a brief on this initiative. I'm very curious, and a lot of people are curious, what is the UN doing? I mean, we host the UN in our countries. We send delegates to the UN, and we are involved in the UN. We trust in the UN in a lot of issues. So I do want to know, and I'm sure a lot of people want to know, what is the UN doing for this horrific crime?
Yes, it is a good question. I just want to give you an experience recently. I was a UN investigator for 15 months for the UN fact-finding mission on Myanmar, and we were deployed by the Human Rights Council. Interestingly, I was deployed before the main violence in Myanmar took place, which took place on the 25th of August 2017. On the second week of September of 2017, I was one of 3 UN investigators on the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh, watching tens of thousands of Rohingya cross the border from clearance operations by the Myanmar military. The stories that they told were of brutal sexual violence, gang rape, sexual slavery, mass killings, total destruction of property. When we sat down, I sat literally under a tree in tens of thousands of people around who had nothing. And the first interview that we had was with a 15-year-old boy, and he told me how his family were killed in front of him 2 days before, and he had witnessed the mass gang rape of women who were then killed. The interviews that I continued to undertake with my colleagues, we heard very similar stories, and we looked at each other and we said, what is happening here? That investigation went on for 15 months. And the investigation work that I undertook in sexual violence led us to one of the conclusions that we were looking at war crimes, crimes against humanity, and including potential acts of genocide. And that has now resulted in a separate mechanism being established by the UN to investigate these crimes further. So there are some positives, and I think we should look at those as well of the UN.
I was not looking at negatives, by the way. My question was straightforward of what the UN is doing and what the UN is not doing. So when we know what the UN is not doing, we can address it. Because today in 2019, I keep saying this number because we are all contributing to the age we are living in. We need to recognize what a problem is in order to put together the solution. either through the UN or through private organizations like Melanie's. Melanie's, you've worked with survivors. You mentioned last night that you've been working with Sylvia as well, talking about this. Can you tell us a little bit about your work? And here I'm going more to the private sector of organizations.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm speaking on behalf of the Mukwege Foundation. And well, what we've been hearing, starting with Celine Bardet and now also Shakar has mentioned it, is the extent to which this crime is happening around the world in almost every conflict, at least large majority of conflicts. So there is this global component, and if you are familiar with Dr. Denis Mukwege, he's a gynecologist humanitarian working in DRC. He also recently won the Nobel Peace Prize, and we work with his vision, basically. He has this idea that he's seen it, of course, in DRC to a massive extent, but it doesn't only stop there. It extends to, well, as was mentioned, World War II with the very famous case with comfort women who were victimized by the Japanese military. If you look at the former Yugoslavia, if you look at Colombia, many of the countries in South America have faced this issue. So it spans every region, and for this reason, we take this idea, this global concept, and the simple idea that everything should be much more survivor-led than is being done at the moment, and we bring this together. And that's why one of the main projects that we're working on and we're facilitating that Sylvia is a part of is our Global Survivor Network. And this brings together women from 20 different countries at the moment, so that they can reach a number of goals. Some of these, for example, would include simply awareness raising. So something like today, where Sylvia has the opportunity to tell her story, to tell about her empowerment, how she has overcome, to just allow the general public to know what's going on. We also work a lot on advocacy with survivors. So bringing them to Human Rights Council, to MPs, to speak with ministries, and really tell from their perspective what they need, what focus there should be in the resources. Another big one is knowledge sharing. Again, if you think this is happening everywhere, but a country like Korea, where in the 1990s, women started coming forward after 50 years to start speaking out against the violence that happened to them during World War II. And because of the way they spoke out, they have made huge changes in their country. It's phenomenal what they've been able to achieve, because survivors themselves have come to the front. They have started protesting every single week in front of the Japanese embassy. They have assisted in creating memorials, in dealing with legal issues, if we're talking about reparations, compensation. So we see this as an opportunity to help other survivors in other countries, for example, Sylvia, who visited Korea also, to learn from these women and to hear, how did you do it in your country? How did you overcome? How did you set up a way to deal with what has happened at a societal level?
So how is it reported first to you or to your organization? How does the reporting of a case or how do victims or survivors come forward to you? This is something.
So we have, as I mentioned, we work with 20 countries. We have about 60 members in the network at the moment. Generally, we always work with local organizations, so they're the ones who might refer survivors, victims to us. And then we see if they're interested, if they're at the phase where they want to start engaging in advocacy and speaking out, or just connecting with other women. What we've learned is trust is huge. So where we don't have that type of trust, it's very difficult to obtain, of course. If you imagine what these women and men have been through, the societies they live in, the stigma that they're facing, it's very difficult for them to come forward. So a lot of the time it's through a sort of snowball technique where we might be in touch with one. I can give the example, we're working here in Lebanon with Syrian survivors, and I'm sure you're aware of the context for Syrian women to come forward. This is one of the most difficult challenges we're facing, because everywhere you hear this is a problem. How do you get survivors to speak? But in some cases, I think you can say, yeah, it's the culture, the safety itself, the fact that they're living as refugees, this has become a very difficult way to get in and to find a way to help these women in the way that we do. But because we have then maybe one contact, which is how it went in Syria, a Syrian woman, she's then able to really build the trust among her community, and then they'll start working with us. But it usually takes time. It's not as simple as them hearing about our work and joining the network.
Thank you. Rachel, there's been, so no one here tells me I'm attacking the UN in any way, shape, or form, by the way. I don't know why the defensiveness happened. But there's been the peacekeeping missions, something that the UN for Women has implemented and it's been successful in its mission. So if you can just briefly tell people about it so people know and renew their faith in the UN, that the UN is doing a lot of great things. And listen, I'm a 31-year-old guy. I grew up listening to the UN. I'm a Palestinian. The UN has failed me in so many ways, but the UN has been very fair to me in so many other ways. The UN is not a friend of mine to be like, oh, I like you or I don't like you. As any government in a democracy which the UN promotes, I should be able to criticize and address failures or mess-ups by the UN.
Of course.
So now I'm addressing something that has been positive by the UN, which is the peacekeeping missions. And I'd like to give you the floor to talk a little bit about it, so no one condemns me of being anti-UN. By the way, I work with the UN on a lot of programs, so you know.
Thank you. 3 brief thoughts before I speak specifically about peacekeeping. One is what we saw with ISIS, which I think is the most prominent recent experience of the most systematic use of sexual violence as a tool for governance and control, and also recruitment, is a phenomenon that continues to go, for women, it continues to be a gap in our justice spectrum. So we've been seeing some elements of justice around what happened, the crimes committed by ISIS, either being adjudicated in Europe or to some degree being adjudicated in Iraq and Syria. But sexual violence has been the most glaring gap in that. There has been almost no legal recognition of the sexual violence crimes committed by ISIS in the countries in the territories that it controlled, and very little in Europe. So when we're talking about accountability for sexual violence, part of it is the documentation work that needs to be done, but part of it is working with member states and international courts to ensure that these crimes are referred and adjudicated. The second, and I think one of the challenges that we have with that, is because it's sexual violence, that it's often seen as a personal thing. There's sex in front of it. It isn't just violence. It isn't just conflict. It's sexual violence. And the fact that that's there often makes it seen as this thing that's too sensitive to touch. We can't deal with sexual violence. That needs to be dealt with within communities, privately, so as not to further shame people. And I think collectively we need to try to cognitively remove sex from sexual violence. We need to delink sexual and violence. And so we recall that it's about violence. It's about a crime that has been committed, that has to be treated as a crime, and that has to have a justice response, in addition to responses to that around reparations and services for survivors, but the whole remit. Because right now our emphasis tends to be too much on, or is weighted to some degree because we have more control over it, on services for survivors without enough of a political push around the justice elements. And then a third, and then I will get on to peacekeeping, is around the continuum of violence. We often hope, I guess, that as soon as there's some kind of peace deal or the guns fall silent, that sexual violence ends. The sexual violence is a continuum. It's something that happens in times of peace, as much similar to how it happens in conflict. It is certainly exacerbated in conflict, but it is a continuum that women face both in their homes and outside of their homes, and has to be treated as such when we're looking at sexual violence in conflict. That it's something that needs to be dealt with in times of recovery, but also in times when we start to see fractures in societies that could lead to conflict. Now on peacekeeping, to clarify, this is not a UN women endeavor. I don't know if I wish it was or wasn't, but it isn't. It is managed directly by the UN Secretariat. And as I mentioned in my remarks earlier, almost all peacekeeping missions now do have a definitive mandate to work on addressing sexual violence, and they do that in a number of ways. So they can both do that in the sort of more obvious way that people hear about, which is that blue helmets will respond or should respond when they hear of incidents of sexual violence happening, and they can respond both defensively, but also in some contexts more than others, aggressively in terms of the use of force. But they also do it in ways that don't involve the use of force. They do it in terms of training national police, in terms of training national military on these issues, in building shelters, and actually having peacekeepers do convoys for NGOs that are moving through areas of high insecurity, of having peacekeepers offer security to mobile courts, and having peacekeepers offer security to survivors of sexual violence going to testify. Now, none of that is happening at a large enough scale, but those are some of the tools that the UN is bringing to bear in this issue in times of conflict.
Antonia, which country do you think has been the best in historically in addressing and in dealing with these kind of crimes against not only women, against the humanity?
Do you know, I really couldn't answer that question. I think it's a very difficult answer to give. Why? Because I don't think any state is doing very well in addressing conflict-related sexual violence. And I'm going to take this opportunity to make 3 points, just following up on peacekeeping and the allegations against UN peacekeepers and civilians, of which we often hear is called sexual exploitation and abuse, transactional sex, survival sex. Well, actually, in most of these contexts, that's not what it is. It's rape, it's a crime, and in conflict contexts, it could constitute a war crime or crime against humanity. That's first. Secondly, we're talking about justice here, and we focused a lot about criminal prosecutions, individual accountability, but justice means very different things to survivors and families of those that have gone through this process. And they may want reparations, compensation, physical and medical care. And so we really need to think outside the box a little bit about what justice means and not focus so much on criminal prosecution, because I can tell you as a lawyer, for hundreds of thousands of people, they will probably never find it. And that's really a sad thing to say at this point. And thirdly, I would like to say that it is really a shame that we're all sat here. Why? Because we're talking about after the violation and the violence has taken place. And we should have more focus on prevention and what we are doing about that and what member states are doing about that. We've had alerts in so many conflicts that something was coming. Violence, sexual violence. Why do we not do more? And I think we as individuals and communities should be pressuring our governments to take action, whether at the national, regional, or international level.
Thank you. We are in a country that has today, in Lebanon, that we have seen a lot of cases of sexual violence. Luckily, we're starting to see amazing people break the silence around this. Artists, politicians, lawyers, members of the community. This is very important. To break the silence is usually the first step towards a resolution. Sylvia, today, for every woman going through a tragic and horrible experience, a victim of this crime, what would your message be to her?
Thank you so much. You know, crime had been committed, so the criminals need to be persecuted for the harm done on our people. If I talk about, like, you know, during war, as out of the experience, many ladies had been gang raped and they are dying silently, fearing to talk about it, yet they are dying silently. So really something needs to be done on this for the harm done on the women. It's too much.
Before I take questions from the audience, Melanie, and this question we did not prepare for. I think a lot of questions we did not prepare for because usually the dynamic on stage will determine the questions, and that's what happened. Melanie, now, just as someone interested in this panel, hence I'm moderating, quickly and like very briefly, the United Nations, the governments and institutions and organizations like yours, if you want to just give me like quick, your feedback, your personal feedback on how they've been dealing with this sort of crimes that's happening in front of our eyes. How do you feel about it? How do you like actually look at it? What's your own as Melanie's?
Well, maybe I'm allowed to speak a bit more freely than other panel members. So that's
No, you guys can all speak freely. We are democracy. We promote democracy day and night. Speak freely, please.
I mean, I think it was already mentioned by Antonia that it's not happening, and governments, to an extent, you can commend governments for the work that they're doing. We work a lot with certain governments in the sense that, yeah, we do see where potentially either whether it's with reparations or just with recognition of the crime, you see that it is possible. The problem is it's a big fight. Every step of the way is a huge fight that does not take into account the needs of survivors or speaks directly with survivors. So I guess my personal opinion, yeah, it's very tiring, it's very difficult, and I think we just need to start doing more, and we're not doing enough. And I think it's great that at least this is having the attention here. I think that's amazing, and that we can really speak about it. But what we see from an NGO's point of view, that it's just, it's more challenges and frustrations than you would like to see. But on the other hand, I would say that I think that times are changing. It might not be so much on the political agenda in practice, but at least if we compare it to 5, 10, 15 years ago, there is this change. So we are optimistic, and I mean, I'll say it again, I think the more that we start involving women like Sylvia, the further we can go, and in a more appropriate way.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Comment. Let me start by saying, sadly enough, now in this very minute that we are talking about this, so many victims, so much ugly behavior is going on in many parts of the world, and what I'm concerned with, our region, Libya, Iraq, Palestine, Yemen, name it. I don't want to blame the UN, because I think these, they are depending on whatever funding comes to them. Half of the funding goes for staff and meeting and conferences and papers and resolutions, and they are trying their very best to help. But honestly speaking, definitely it is not up to the expectation, because they raise the expectation, they over-exaggerate of what they are doing. At the end of the day, I have been following them in Libya. It is going to the south, it's visiting some refugees, taking pictures, putting it on their website, and we're visiting it. So it's very, very, very limited. It's a long story, I don't want to go into it, but we need to keep pressuring the UN that business should not continue to be done as usual. We cannot. For 8 years, everything is continuing the way it is going, so. But what I have to say, at the end of the day, it all goes back to politics, to the role of politicians, to the role of intervention. Everybody knows now, in Libya, are we, the Libyans, deciding the future of Libya? No. Everybody's interfering for the damn oil that we have, the economy, the business, the military. They supported Gaddafi for 42 years as a dictator, and now they are coming back to support humanitarian support. No. We have a government that has been set in exile by the European and the American and God knows whom, and they call it the internationally recognized government. So, will this government give a damn about what's happening to sexual violence or to women or to children or to humanitarian aid? Of course not. They just want to be stuck to their position, and they're playing the game. So, in my opinion, we are really dwelling around the problem. At the end of the day, and we need a leap. We need a new discourse. We need a new revolution. We need new militias of women to start think differently about this, because thousands of conferences, meetings, documents, research, data. But then next year we come and we will repeat the same story again. And the women are dying, and the children are dying, and the poverty is increasing, and the solution, political solution. We have been waiting 8 years in Libya for a political solution. Millions of children are dying. Hundreds and thousands of Syrians are refugees. Africa, and the corruption of all these leaders, and they call them leaders and they bring them to the UN and to give speeches. It is the dictatorship, it's the corruption, it's the hypocrisy of the West, it is politics at the end of the day. And women must now start really pushing themselves to be into politics.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello? I have the mic.
I'm gonna.
Hello?
Sorry.
I've got the mic over here.
Where's the mic?
Over here.
Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Talar. Thank you very much for having the energy you do at 5:30 p.m. and your contribution. And regarding the UN, when I was a student in my university, we had a very good summary of what the UN was. And the idea is that it's better that it exists than if it didn't exist. So I feel like that's the big summary of it all. Because it contributes a lot, but obviously it has its problems. But it's better that it exists. But one thing I wanted to ask, I wanted to go to the flip side of this topic, is the people who work on sexual violence as a weapon of war, or GBV people and stuff, and we see a lot of burnout that happens with humanitarian aid workers or people who work in the UN and stuff. And I would like to know, as women who have experience in these fields personally, especially Ms. Akan, I'm very humbled to be here with you, and everyone else who's working on it. How do you avoid this burnout and the secondary emotional distress that you might gain? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Who would like to answer this question?
Well, I've been doing this work for 20 years. And I think what you say is very true, and we have to be alive to this fact. I think, who are we serving? So, for example, it's about empowering the individuals and the communities, and I really want to applaud Sylvia for speaking up today, because it takes incredible courage to come forward, and this is what we need more of. Because if individuals do not come forward, if they do not report, we can't know the nature and the scale of the crime, and we can't start to address it. It's related to power, economic power, political power. That is what we're dealing with, so it's complex. I just want to give you a little story. I gave a very short, I promise, but I gave a very bleak outlook. So something positive. I finished the UN investigation, and now I represent 400 Rohingya women in their victims' submission before the International Criminal Court. And it's taken such strength and courage for them to come forward. And we do music therapy. They love Frozen, the song that. We sing it with them. We do yoga with them. We do drama. You have to think outside the box. Creative therapies. It's a long road to justice, so we're hand-holding them. So I think we are also at a moment, at a juncture. This year, there's so many conferences on conflict-related sexual violence. I believe we have to come together, create momentum, push for change, as I say, within your own governments and outside of that. And within the UN as well, who are taking strides. They're part of the problem, but they are also part of the solution.
Thank you. One last question I'll take from the... Sorry.
Sound.
And thank you for the four ladies that intervene. I would like to rebuttal this question differently. I do not like to put the UN or the United Nations organization on trial here. I am more interested in looking at what each country we're talking about here in the Middle East is doing. I mean, we know what the UN does. However, it's us grassroots people, what are we doing? What are you doing in Libya? You have discussed, you've been throwing things on the United Nations, on the foreign powers. This is a problem we have been living with in the Middle East for decades. What are we today as educated people that are coming from the West back to the Middle East? What are we doing and what can we do? Those are the questions. And in this instance, we can then we can ask, in fact, the NGOs to become accountable. We take the power from them, we re-empower ourselves, and go forward. Because the question you ask the panel, you're putting them on trial, and it's not fair. They are doing their share. What I'd like to ask them, in fact, is in their reports, what have you found that grassroots movement in every one of those countries can do? Can any one of you rebuttal that question or reply for it? Thank you.
Thank you. Before the question is, first, as I said several times, ma'am, the UN was not, and I will say it again very firmly, the UN was not put in trial on this panel. There was a question raised, very clear question, about how the UN is dealing with these kinds of crime. I repeated several times during the session that there are a lot of great things that the UN is doing, and we mentioned one of them, which is the peacekeeping mission. The UN is not put on trial, but as you mentioned earlier, we today are promoting the citizen engagement in the organizations and the governments that run our affairs. The first step that begins with this kind of scope is to see and to check how can business be done differently, because time is evolving, so should all the organizations that are running the affairs related to our time. By no means the UN here is in any way put on trial or condemned, but we have, time is, as I said, time is evolving. We have increasing amounts of tragedies happening, such as 68 million people are displaced today. With the displacement of 68 million people comes a lot of crimes, comes a lot of issues, and we need, from the perspective of promoting citizen engagement, we do need to start discussing these matters in order to change some policies, change some ways, some tactics of dealing with these crimes in order to find a solution for it. I mean, 30 years ago, and I just want to address this before we conclude the panel. 30 years ago, displacement, for example, we were told that displacement is going to get, I was told as a kid raised up in a refugee camp in Beirut, I was told that time is gonna solve my issues, things are gonna get better. 30 years after, I see 68 million people are displaced. I do have the right to address this. I do have the right to tell how business should be redone in order to cope with our times today. We want to be thinking with our brain, not our heart. We want to put our foot down to our leaders, to our governments, to our institutions, and tell them this is how things should be done in order for our world to get better. The UN is doing amazing work. The UN on so many aspects. I'm a boy of the UN. I'm a boy who lined up for food and for medicine from the UN. How can I condemn the UN, or how can I put the UN on trial? But I have to tell the UN, we need to work together in order to get things better, especially when it comes to sexual violence, crimes against humanity, crimes against children, crimes against women. That's my reply to putting the UN on trial. The UN was never put on trial on this panel, and I refuse to say that. I'm a boy of the UN, I salute the UN, and I fully respect the UN. Thank you. Anyone would like to answer the question?
Okay, can you repeat the question?
Sorry?
The role of grassroots organizations.
The partnerships between grassroots organizations and the UN. should give like a UN hug at the end of this.
Let me say, I didn't feel that I was put on trial. I don't know if my other UN colleagues in the room felt otherwise. So I think it is good. We need more open dialogue. That is certainly, the UN needs to be doing its work better. I think we have come, as everyone said, I'm just repeating what's been said before, geopolitics is at the heart of this. I think the UN often tries to apply technical solutions to political problems. We have political arms of the UN that are trying to deal with these problems, such as special envoys, the Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs. It just got a new name, that's why I stumbled over it, I apologize. But a lot of what we do is, indeed, trying to put a Band-Aid on what is a political issue. And so it's trying to get those parts to work better together, and a key part of that is member states in the Security Council and trying to find a resolution. But that said, we do need to have more engagement, absolutely, with local communities in the UN. Thank you.
Thank you. So, wrapping up this, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Super quick, just to add to that, because what we're trying to do is exactly that. So if your question is about grassroots level, what are they doing? We're working very closely with these networks. Also, for example, again, take the opportunity to speak to Sylvia. That's exactly what she's doing, but we're also working in this region. So if that's your interest, I would be more than happy to tell you more about those initiatives ongoing now.
Thank you, and Antonia wants to
Just quickly, I think grassroots organizations have an incredible role to play. They're normally the ones that are closest to the survivors and the communities. They can play a very big part in advocacy. I would just say that if they are documenting and interviewing survivors of sexual violence, you really need to have the right skill set to do that. And I would just urge that caution and hesitation of moving forward in documentation.
Thank you. Antonia, thank you so much for all the work you do from a legal point of view. We do need the legal participation. Sylvia, I can't describe my admiration for the courage, like Antonia mentioned earlier, to come up and speak, because this is protecting so many lives. Melanie, thank you for the work, the amazing work you do. I'm sure you guys are expecting now my last remark. Rachel, thank you for, no, I mean it, because thank you for the great work the United Nations does. We want to see, the UN is like our family. We all want the best for our family, so we want to see.
I didn't feel under attack.
Thank you. Thank you so much for all the great work, and thank you for being on this panel.
شكراً. Thank you to all the speakers, moderators. شكراً لكم لكل اللي كانوا موجودين اليوم. أكيد الموعد السنة الجاية على الأكيد بذات المستوى أفضل بعد، لأنه كل سنة نحن بنتقدم. شكر باسم معالي الوزيرة دكتورة مي شدياء يلي اضطرت أنه تمشي لضرورات وزارية، فبتشكركم أكيد. بدنا نسحب كمان وبدنا نشكر السبونسرز BLC تاتش وUN Women. رح نسحب اسم الرابح أو الرابحة يلي كانوا ناشطين اليوم على تويتر مع ميراي. ميرسي لكم ميراي كمان على الثقة اللي بتعطوني إياها كل سنة.
أكيد في ثقة. أصلاً رانيا أنت بتحلي كل البانلز. We want to thank everyone, and we want to thank the UN for their participation and cooperation. All women here, they showed that they are really courageous. We found that everyone here, we show admiration to everyone. But we have to say, I have to say something. Maybe we are half of the society. Maybe we have to do something about education. We are raising children, our children this way. So maybe we need to do something to pass into action in a different way. Since we are half of the society, we should raise our children differently. We have to make change. I know that there will be a lot of opposition and contradictions, but we have to do something inside of our households. We have to begin there before we begin with the community. Thank you so much. رح بسحب هلا رابح، وإن شاء الله الكل يربحوا، بس مجبورين بواحد. ايه اوكي. على كل حال طلعت وحده مش واحد. نوال مدللي اوه مبروك، تفضلي.
من مجوهرات كلاس كوبون بكادو.
MCF team Zena Shamaoun, MCF team on stage, MCF team